All right, guys, Sixers cap space scenarios. I've been looking forward to this one. I'm going to go over how they can go after some of their rumored targets, Paul George, Jimmy Butler, uh, Brandon Ingram, and also how they could keep some of their guys. And this one could take a while, so I'm just going to get right into it. And before I get started, please like the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Still a brand new channel, and it would help tremendously with its growth. All right, guys, please do not skip this part and go straight to the scenarios. I'm going to give a lot of important information out to help you get better background info on what I'm going to do so you could better understand how I did these things. So first, just quick analysis on what the Sixers have going on right now. They've got Joel Embiid, the only player guaranteed on their payroll. And then they've got several non-guaranteed players, Paul Reed, Jeff Dowden, Ricky Council. I think the latter two very well could get cut. Paul Reed, it depends. If I think there's a good chance that they keep him if there's a trade that they can use a salary for, but I could also see them cutting him, maybe trying to re-sign him later if they're able to get a max player. Then they've got that first round pick, the number 16 overall pick. I think they traded, but not quite for the reasons you might think. There's you would think, yeah, they're gonna try to trade it for a player who can help them. I expect them to pursue that, but I also think there's a very good chance that by draft night they trade that pick just mainly to get out of the first round completely. Maybe they could roll it over for a future first round pick, but I could also see them trading down and down and down until they're out of the first round and they just get some second round picks, and that would save them about $3 million. They can have some second round picks this year and they can sign them and they won't count against the cap until the end of July. So that would be really advantageous for their salary cap situation. Then you've got all their free agents going on. You got a lot of guys like Tobias Harris, Buddy Hield. They could all be sign and trade candidates. D'Anthony Melton too. The only ones that are really important though is Tyrese Maxey, and they're going to keep that $13 million cap hold, which means that they're going to renounce all these cap holds in order to have all the cap space they're going to have. They're going to eliminate all these numbers. That means that they can't re-sign them with their bird rights anymore. They could re-sign them with cap space, but Tyrese Maxey is the one that they want to keep that 13 million cap hold. It's going to interfere with their cap space, but then once they're at the cap, they could resign him up to the max. And then out of all the other free agents, the one I think that is that could come to significance is Kenyon Martin Jr. And I'll explain a little later, but he could be a very crucial sign and trade candidate. And when you go to their cap space projections, I got a couple of different scenarios going on, but I think the one that's truly important is this one right here, that 53.7 million. I think that's the most likely number that they're gonna look at since it factors in keeping Tyrese Maxey. And the last thing to note, they've got these exceptions, but all these trade exceptions are gonna get renounced. They're gonna forfeit them because you can't have cap space and trade exceptions, so they'll all be gone, and they'll have this exception left over, the room mid level. So once they spend all their cap space, they get to the cap, they can have this extra $8 million to spend, and they can give up to a 3-year deal with it. So now I want to explain Tyrese Maxey's situation just a little more, because last offseason they didn't extend him, which was pretty shocking, and now it's understood why. It's because they wanted to pursue this cap space path that they're about to do. So this is the maximum that he can get this summer. It's 5 years projected at $205 million, will start at just over $35 million. He's going to get this full amount. The Sixers made him take a really big risk by having him go into the season without an extension. Something could have happened injury-wise, but thankfully, not only did he make it through the season, he had a career year. So he's getting that max contract. But order of operations matters. What's going to happen is they're going to spend all their cap space first, get to the salary cap line, and then they could go over the cap to re-sign him to this amount. So that $13 million cap hold, that's going to be what he counts against the cap while they're doing all their cap space stuff. Had they extended him last year and he'd already be having this $35 million amount, that's $20 million less in cap space, and that would have severely hampered their plans to get a third max player. I'm going to go through a very basic type of scenario that the Sixers could do to get a guy like Paul George or Jimmy Butler and try to field a strong starting lineup afterwards. I'm going to start something simple, and I'll slowly get a little more complicated as I go. But before I do that, I first want to show how the Sixers can maximize their cap space to the fullest extent they possibly can. So here's a cap sheet that it assumes that they've already waived Paul Reed, Jeff Dowden, Ricky Council, and they've traded their first round pick there out of the first round. And the only things they have on their cap sheet is Joel Embiid, his $51.4 million, and Tyrese Maxey's $13 million restricted free agent cap hold. And that would leave them with just under $65 million. Now you might be thinking, Yossi, I just paused the video. 141 million minus 65 million and 76 million. Shouldn't the Sixers have more cap space? Are you sure you're even qualified to do this? And the reason is that there's something called incomplete roster charges. For every roster spot a team has below 12, they have $1.2 million, which is the rookie minimum for this particular season, count against their cap space. This is the best way to visualize it. Here I've got Embiid, Maxey, and then 10 incomplete roster charges. When you add it all together, that's $76 million accounting against the payroll, and that puts it at 65 million cap space. And for the moment you've all been waiting for, let's go ahead and sign some free agents. So let's say Paul George is available and they're able to sign him outright. I'm going to use him as the example instead of Jimmy Butler. I think he's a little more gettable, but you can plug in Jimmy Butler since they're basically making the same salary range. So if they sign him outright, his first year salary is projected at just under 50 million. That would leave them with just under $17 million in cap space left over to find someone else. They'd have the room exception after, and then they have to field the rest of the roster with minimum signings. Now, that's not a lot of cap space left over. If they're lucky, they can get one other starter quality guy. They definitely do need another wing. Now, there are some things that the Sixers could try to do if they sign a player like Paul George to get a little more cap space. They can have him get some unlikely bonuses, such as making it to the second round or winning 48 games, and that would give him a couple more million cap space. They could also have him take less on a 1 year deal and then put him in a position where if he resigns next year, he'd be right back at the max. But I'm going to assume that Paul George isn't going to play any games with that, and that the Sixers, if they sign Paul George, will be at the full max. So with their remaining cap space, the Sixers decide they want to pursue another wing player. I think they're going to need someone in that $14 to $16 million range, someone like a Dorian Finney-Smith or a Deni Avdija. So I'm going to put Deni Avdija for now. The Sixers can trade up to 5 first-round picks this summer. So if they really wanted to get aggressive, they should have enough assets to acquire him. And now that they used all their cap space, they can fill out the rest of the roster. Now they re-signed Tyrese Maxey to his $35 million amount. That $13 million cap hold is gone. They've used the room level exception on Kelly Oubre, which is a pretty common scenario that a lot of people are floating around that think will happen. And that's their starting five, pretty solid starting five. And then they've got, 9 minimum contracts to fill out the rest of the roster. So now you're hoping that you can bring back guys like Kyle Lowry, Nick Batum, and just hope that you get some really good veterans to join you. And I've got them with their second round pick this year. And they are able to have a pretty not a very big luxury tax payment at all, not a very expensive roster by any means. And they didn't do anything that would hard cap them to any of the apron levels. So they are still able to exceed that $178.7 million amount if they need to later in the season. And that could be very useful maybe in the trade deadline. They're able to combine some of these minimum players and whatever draft picks they have left to bring in another rotation player. Now I want to go over another scenario, and this one's going to be a little more of a challenge, a bit more complicated. And this basically assumes that things are not quite going well for the Sixers. They're striking out on targets in this scenario. Paul George, he's back with the Clippers. They can't afford to lose him. They match the 4-year max the Sixers are offering. Jimmy Butler, the Heat give him the extension he wants, and they bring him back. He's unavailable now. So I'm going to have them trade for Brandon Ingram. I think out of all the all-star level wings that are available, I think he's the most gettable for the Sixers. And they have the assets, in my opinion, to acquire him. And they can use their cap space, but I'm going to have them do a more complicated sign and trade scenario so they can maximize their cap space and get more free agents. And then the other thing I'm going to assume is that the room and level exception won't be enough to re-sign Kelly Oubre, meaning they'll have to use cap space to resign him. This might be somewhat of a contrarian opinion so far on his market value, but I get the feeling there's going to be multiple teams offering the full mid-level exception, which would start at just under $13 million for next season. Maybe doesn't get the full 4-year amount, but he had one of his best seasons last year. I think he's proven he can be effective for a good team. and he's made below market value the past few years with Charlotte, and he made the minimum last year with the Sixers. I would guess that he might want to get as much money as possible this offseason, considering all that. So first, I'm cutting Ricky Council and Jeff Dowden again, and they're trading their first round pick, but they're going to keep Paul Reed and Kenyon Martin's minimum cap hold. Those will be for a trade later. And putting all this together, they will be working with $57.5 million in cap space. Now let's add some free agents. So I went ahead and had them trade for Deni Avdija again. I think that just with that inexpensive salary, that's a great addition to have. Maybe it takes like 2 first-round picks to absorb him, so they bring him in. Then I've got them re-signing Kelly Oubre. Let's say it takes 4 for 60 to resign him, make a start as low as 14 million. And then I have him adding a guy like Najee Marshall. I think he'd also be a great fit there. Let's say it takes 3 years, 28 million to sign him, could start as low as just under 9 million. These are just some projected figures I came up with. Doesn't necessarily mean that's what they're going to get. Maybe they get a little more, maybe they get a little less. And after fielding this roster, they are left with 22.5 million in cap space. Now let's trade for Brandon Ingram. So let's say they gave up 2 firsts to get Deni Avdija. They can use the remaining 3 to incentivize the Pelicans to trade Brandon Ingram. So this would be a multi-team trade scenario where these pieces are not necessarily heading to New Orleans, but maybe to other teams that are in a rebuilding situation, getting some other assets for taking them. Ingram has a trade bonus, but I'm going to have him waive it just to make this trade easier. So I've got a sign and trade going on from the Sixers end. Tobias Harris signs for roughly 3 for 60, using the remaining 22.5 million cap space that the Sixers were left over with. And then I'm also including Paul Reed and KJ Martin. So the thing with KJ Martin is I kept that cap hold, that $2 million cap hold. The Sixers have his full bird rights. And this was a really savvy acquisition, getting him in as part of the Harden trade, because they could technically re-sign him up to the max and use his outgoing salary to help salary matching in trades. However, they can't just game it and make his salary whatever they want. One, there's a rule that limits the amount that he counts as for the Sixers' outgoing salary, and it's usually by half. And the other thing is, no team's gonna want to take KJ Martin if he's going to have like a really high first year salary. But only the first year needs to be guaranteed. Anytime you sign a trade player, it needs to be a 3-year deal, but the 2 last years could be non-guaranteed. So if he's got $5.8 million from the salary perspective in the trade, that means he's making roughly 12 million in his first year salary. And that's just a creative thing that the Sixers could do. Maybe they don't end up using KJ Martin in this scenario, but when you put it all together, they are able to match Brandon Ingram's $36 million salary. And I think that's going to be important, that they don't take back more salary than they're sending out. Because if you're going to have a max player in Joel Embiid, a max player in Tyrese Maxey, and then a third max player in Brandon Ingram, and then all these other players that you're signing, plus the room level exception, I think you're going to have to be able to exceed that $178.6 million first apron amount to fill out the roster as strong as it needs to be. And then the Sixers successfully traded for Brandon Ingram, and they are now over the salary cap, and now they can go ahead and fill out the rest of the roster. So they re-signed Tyrese Maxey, and they use the room mid-level. Obviously, if you can get Kelly Oubre on the room mid-level and re-sign and sign somebody else with that cap space, that'd be great. Najee Marshall's a guy I could also see getting the room mid-level. One other guy I thought of is Haywood Highsmith. He's a guy who was with the Sixers, with the Blue Coats in the past. Now he really panned out with the Heat, and I could see his market in that room mid-level range. So maybe he's a guy the Sixers like to bring back, especially if they don't have enough big versatile wings like I added onto this roster in my scenario. And then they fill out the rest of the roster. Only 6 minimum players, so a lot better than that other scenario. Roster's a little more expensive, exceeds just over 200 million than that Paul George scenario. And they are able to exceed that $178.7 million first apron, which I mentioned earlier. I think that's important if they're going to field this level of talent. And they're not allowed to exceed the $189.5 million second apron. That's because they aggregated multiple players to acquire Brandon Ingram. But that's fine. They've got just enough, more than enough flexibility below it if they need to add more to the payroll later on in the year. And overall, I just think this scenario is more fun. It allowed them to get a deeper level of talent. Obviously, the Sixers don't have to maximize all the different salary cap flexes they can do, like the KJ Martin aspect or just doing a sign and trade in general. But if they can just get a little creative when it comes to using their cap space, I think that can go a long way to fielding the best roster they can.